Hello all. Thank you for joining us for this webinar discussion, Reading America 250, Learning Civics Through Literature. It will soon be our nation's 250th birthday. Are you ready? It's time to start thinking about the meaning of America. This webinar is a great place to start, so we're very glad to have you with us. I'm Tom Kelly, Senior Vice President and Chief Program Officer at the Jack Miller Center, an organization committed to education the principles of the American founding, their place in our history. Most of you are probably familiar with how we go about doing that, supporting a growing network of professors who teach the American political tradition, leveraging that network for the benefit of K-12 teachers. And as you might guess, most of our scholars are in political science and history. Our teachers teach government or U.S. history. Literature is not typically part of their syllabi or curricula. So you might think, why focus on literature? Shouldn't kids be learning the three branches of government? It's a fair question, and one that I will pose to our guest here, Professor Stuart Warner, who I'll introduce in just a minute. But I can say that we at JMC have found using literature to be a particularly effective way of addressing the primary or fundamental question that a student of civics faces. Why does any of this matter? Literature helps us to bring these abstract principles of liberty, equality, and justice, the big ideas that animate American political life, down to earth, put them in human terms that implicate our lives, how we choose to live. So we found them to be very effective in our teacher programs and with students. For selections, we frequently turn to this edited volume, what so proudly we hail, The American Soul in Story, Speech, and Song, which is edited by Amy and Leon Cass and Diana Schaub. And we highly recommend that collection. I feature short written pieces that help us understand what it means to be an American, our obligations as citizens. We've used selections, as I say, in teacher programs, but also in JMC staff retreats. If that appeals to you, you might consider checking out our jobs board on our website. The title I would say, though, is a little bit misleading. It refers to story, speech, and song, whereas most of what is contained in the volume are short stories. And the reason for that emphasis on short stories, as the editors explain, is as follows. By furnishing our imaginations with well-drawn characters confronting concrete difficulties in well-defined circumstances, a well-crafted story can shed light on our national character and civic practices. They call it a perfect vehicle for generating fruitful self-examination and self-knowledge. Now, self-knowledge is evocative of Socrates' and mission to know thyself, more typically the province of philosophy than civic education. But for JMC, understanding founding principles requires a uniquely philosophical frame of mind. And it's that we find that literature can really help cultivate. And so we'd like to talk about that today with Professor Stewart. And we're thrilled to have you with us, Professor Stewart Warner. Thanks for being with us. Just by way of brief introduction of Professor Warner, he's a professor of philosophy at Roosevelt University in Chicago. His scholarship is focused on some of the great philosophical minds, including Locke, Spinoza, Burke, Bentham, Hegel, Hume, and perhaps especially Montesquieu. You getting all those? Yeah, I think that's right. At Roosevelt, Stewart helps students, many of them first-time college goers, to access these important ideas, the ideas of these important thinkers through a variety of courses, perhaps most relevant for our circumstances today, including philosophy in film and philosophy in literature. Now, in addition to his scholarship and teaching, Stewart has directed the JMC-affiliated Campus Center, the Montesquieu Forum, since 2008. He's also participated in a number of JMC teacher programs, including a seminar at Roosevelt University in 2019, where we discussed the story that we're going to focus on today, Willa Cather's The Best Years. I should also add that Stewart is joining us from Riverside, Illinois, which is actually my hometown. So while I did not know Stewart while I was growing up there, apparently Stewart knew my family long before that. And he tells everybody, so I will just share that, yes, my mother did back into his car at one point a long time ago. But that is water under the bridge, right, Stewart? So we're gonna let that go and get started here. So we'll talk about we'll talk about our best years for about 45 minutes here, and then we'll take audience questions, which you can submit through the Q&A function. Um, and then we'll close. Okay. So my first question for you, Stuart, to get the conversation going, is just on the educational importance of literature generally. How is literature essential for education, and how is it essential for civic education specifically?
That's a good question, Tom, and a difficult one. I think that there's an intimate link between philosophy and literature. Literature deals with the particular, the concrete. Philosophy deals with things that are abstract, but they intertwine. Insofar as literature tells stories, has a narrative, has a story arc, has a theme, a plot, characterization, it inexorably has to do with ideas. Philosophy, of course, is the standard bearer for the presentation of ideas. Um, I think in my own courses, what I like to do is to present literature philosophically and philosophy literarily. Literature always rests on an imaginative act. And when one is reading literature, one similarly engages in an imaginative act, imagining oneself in the circumstances that the main characters are in, imagining what might happen to one if one were involved in the actions or the activities that the principal characters are. I don't think you have several young children. I used to have young children. It's not a coincidence that we read to them, and what we read to them is literature. And we can see in their eyes the way they are mesmerized by what we're reading to them. So, one of the things, in fact, in my philosophy classes, very frequently I start out with literature as opposed to more established philosophical texts and short stories in particular. So I think that's one way in. But another way in is also to talk about Cather and Cather's writings and short stories.
Hmm. Hmm. No, what about the civic dimension? How does civics enter into that? Do you see, is there a kind of natural connection between the imaginative act, the imagination that literature, especially short stories, kind of conjures or cultivates? Um, how does that relate to preparing people to engage in our political life or public life?
I think there's a difference between reading literature in one's armchair
Hmm.
and reading it in a as part of a collective enterprise.
Okay.
So in school, whether it be elementary or high school, secondary school, or in college, one is typically reading works of fiction and discussing them with other students and with faculty members. And that forms a community of scholars, a community of thinkers who are sharing the reading and sharing the discussion and sharing the discovery of ideas that whatever it is they're reading might hold. And I think since we're talking not just about civics in the context of JMC, civic education,
Hmm.
what happens when students come together, whether it be 5, 10, 15, or 20, they join a union with each other. It becomes a shared enterprise. And I think one of the things that civics involves is what it means to live as part of various shared enterprises. And by a shared enterprise, what I'm really referring to are various forms of human association. In the case of the short story before us, The Best Years, there are various forms of association on display.
Hmm.
There, the county schools, there's the Ferguson family,
Hmm.
there's the leadership of the county schools, Evangeline Knightley, uh,
Hmm.
there's the town where they live, there's the state where they live, Nebraska, and there's the country. Back to literature. So when one's reading literature, one's reading it as part of a collective body when it concerns education in schools, which I think is
Yeah.
JMC, and it's my principal interest. And so that's a miniature body politic,
Right.
using politic there, I think metaphorically. So I think short stories, this short story in particular, raises questions that Aristotle, for example, raises at the beginning of his Politics, Plato raises in the Republic, Montesquieu raises in the first 8 books of the Spirit of Laws. What's a family? What's a
Mhm.
political community? Is there a difference between a smaller political community and a larger political community? How do they relate to each other? Are some of them endogenous? Are some of them exogenous? So insofar as one is talking about planned educational activities and undertakings, one is talking about a body of individuals as a family as a body, a city as a body, a village as a body, etc. So I don't think you can escape from the fact that anytime educationally, one is reading something that concerns human beings living together,
Mhm.
there are civic questions that are inescapable.
Right, right. So the civic questions arise, and then the act of reading together is itself a kind of civic act when, when it's a group of people together reading and discussing a shared text. So that there are kind of dual civic dimensions there. But go
Just
ahead.
for
Yeah.
1 second, Tom. In political activities in a city,
Hmm.
ultimately there are boards who make decisions and the decision has authority. There
Hmm.
are elections, and elections carry with them certain authorities. There are certain offices that have duties and carry certain authorities. But that's not true in education. In the most profound sense, there is no authority. All right. There's shared conversation in which we're trying to approach the best answer to important questions. And that's very different. And I think what that does is that it inculcates certain dispositions, habits of mind, certain virtues that then have a purchase when it comes to more traditional political and civil activities, things
Hmm.
having to do with acceptance, things having to do with listening to the views of others, things
Hmm.
having to do with deliberation. All those things come out when one has a common book in front of one. And the
Hmm.
ideas, especially if they're literary, because they really touch in one way or another, if they're good choices, one's life. Through an act of imagination, one can always enter into them, even though, believe me, I've never lived in Nebraska. I've never worked in Nebraska. I've never been to Nebraska. I don't think I would do well in Nebraska. There's not enough concrete and I grew up in Brooklyn. There's much too much open space. But nevertheless, the first time I read Cather to my wife after we were married in the evening. I read My Antonia, I think maybe her most famous novel, and we both cried, despite the fact that the circumstances of the novel and the
Hmm.
circumstances of this short story, which also makes me cry,
Right.
are quite different from my own life, because literature enables one to enter into worlds very different from one's own.
Yeah. And you mentioned that there isn't an authority in the way that there could be perhaps when you're discussing a philosophical treatise. I mean, there is something more of a hierarchy to understand the rational argument that's being made in a treatise. More expertise is needed than perhaps try to find meaning in, say, the short story that we're going to read or discuss here today. Is there some truth to that?
There's some truth to it, but I
Mhm.
think it has to be qualified.
Okay.
So in my philosophy classes, when I'm so last year I taught probably the philosophical book I know best that I've translated and written on, Montesquieu's Persian Letters. It was clear I knew vastly more than any of the students in the class. I had 20 students. The best thing I ever did was record that whole sequence of classes because I had a recording of all of the things I learned from my students.
Okay.
I'm the first, but among a group of people who are approaching a text.
Right.
And I
Right.
can bring more to it and more expertise in a variety of ways.
Hmm.
But philosophy, uh, literature are so relationally organized that if one knows one thing that somebody else doesn't have, one is able to pick up on something in the book that another person, because that person doesn't know what the former does, simply won't be able to see.
Yeah.
So life experiences that my students can bring or the secondary material can bring that I just don't have. Even the way something is worded, even
Hmm.
if it's not a new idea, its very wording might be suggestive to me of some notion that I hadn't thought of. And I think if one's open minded about what one is teaching and realizes one can never have a complete grasp of anything worth knowing in philosophy or literature.
Yeah.
You have approached books with this open mindedness and a willingness to learn, then while I may or others might be authorities, nevertheless, in just to put a cap on this, one of the Montesquieu forums I did was on Shakespeare's The Tempest, and I had Paul Cantor, who
Hmm.
alas is no longer with us, but was a great Shakespeare scholar at Virginia. And in his first book, Shakespeare's Pagan World, in his acknowledgement, he acknowledges an undergraduate student of his, John Briggs, who corrected him on something that Paul had thought was important. Yet the undergraduate knew more. Was
Hmm.
Paul an authority in this class he was teaching? He was teaching it at Harvard at the time. Of course he was. Nevertheless, that doesn't make him a know it all.
Hmm.
And so, even in that context, with the recognition of an authority, if there's some sense that students, all students, can say something important, whether they're smart or they're just beginning, they're learned, they're only starting out. That's what's so extraordinary about the practice of education, the shared undertaking and a willingness to expand one's mind and horizon.
That's great, and that gives me confidence to actually move forward and discuss this story with you. So why don't we turn to the story, and I'll just offer a brief synopsis to kind of lay the groundwork here. There are spoilers for those who have not read the story in here. We're gonna cover at least the entirety of the plot here, but this won't take long. But I do want to have a kind of foundation upon which to build our conversation. So The Best Years is a story about a family living in McAlpin, Nebraska in 1899. We encounter the family at first through the eyes of a school district superintendent, Miss Evangeline Knightley, in the early days of public school. Miss Knightley visits a school whose teacher is a conscientious 16-year-old girl, Leslie Ferguson. She takes Leslie home for a weekend, and we get to meet Leslie's family, including Mrs. Ferguson, who was a person not to be missed or not to be overlooked, we're told, because she cuts a fine figure and she gets things done. We meet Leslie's father, Mr. Ferguson, or Old Ferg, who has drooping shoulders and is a farmer, but a thinking farmer, an idealist and a dreamer with unconventional habits that make him the butt of local jokes. We meet her four brothers as well. They're a very loving family, a fact illustrated to us particularly brilliantly by the children's shared love of the attic where they sleep. The family doesn't have much money, but the attic is full of blissful shared memories for the children, memories of warm beds, even or especially as sleet sneaks through the shingles amidst distant train whistles on a winter night. After seeing the family up close for a bit, we're brought forward 20 years and see significant changes to all involved. Miss Knightley, now Mrs. Thorndyke, has married and appears prosperous. In place of The charming but plain Mrs. Knightley, who's now Mrs. Thorndyke. The superintendent is now a modern girl named Wanda Bliss with a bobbed blonde hair and crimson lips. The automobile has taken over in McAlpin. The Fergusons are wealthier too. The final scene is between Miss Knightley, now Mrs. Thorndyke, and Mrs. Ferguson. Mrs. Thorndyke has not seen the family in 15 years. On her way back east, she's from Maine, she visits Mrs. Ferguson, who is lame from slipping on her steps in her new house. Mrs. Thorndyke congratulates Mrs. Ferguson on the success of her sons, who all have important jobs away from home as sheep ranchers, a scientist, department store employee. Mrs. Ferguson thanks her for this. She's appreciative, but wants only to talk about her daughter Leslie, who we find out in an earlier point in the story had died 20 years before after getting pneumonia following a blizzard. Mrs. Ferguson pines for the old way of life. She misses the old house, as do the boys who have remained boys, she says, and are practical like she is rather than dreamers like their father. She expresses disdain for those in middle age who think they can better themselves, for folks that try to be like the advertisements, as she says. Well, this I know, she says. Our best years are when we're working hardest and getting right ahead, when we can hardly see our way out. After a little more conversation, Miss Thorndyke departs, never to see the Fergusons again, though she does send a long letter sometime later, which is then shared with the sons. So that's my summary. Stuart, is there anything you'd like to add to that before we begin discussing it, or anything you think I missed or overemphasized?
Well, maybe both as a way of adding something and directing our conversation. One of the things that matters in the story are the names. For example, we never learn Mrs. Ferguson's first name. We learn Mr. Ferguson's first name, James Graham Ferguson. So that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
The names of the four sons of the family.
Yeah.
Three of them surely are important. Hector, who fought for Troy in the Trojan War. Homer, of course, who wrote about the Trojan War. Bryan, William Jennings Bryan, who ran for president 3 times and lost. Finally, a Democrat wins after Bryan, and that's Woodrow Wilson, who's involved in the Democratic Party and is advantaged by this finally, and is a great admirer of William Jennings Bryan, which is why he named his son Bryan. Nobody other than Mr. Ferguson.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Ferguson names Leslie. We're told this, and she makes a great deal of her name because there's a way of pronouncing it with an S as in Leslie, or with a Z as in Leslie.
Right.
Turns out the name, like the name Ferguson, is a Scottish name, and it means Garden of Evergreen. That means something. Ms. Knightley, who winds up being married to Ralph Thorndyke, is Evangeline Knightley.
Right.
Evangeline is someone who is an evangelist, who brings good news, is a messenger. She's a knight. She's a defender of noble causes.
Right.
So it doesn't, you read over the short story, oh, it's light, this is an interesting character, this or that. But our attention upon careful reading, I think, is called to the names.
Absolutely.
You had mentioned, and I want to reinforce this important point, the coming of the automobile. Within the first 5 lines of the short story, we read that Evangeline Knightley is traveling within her district because she's a county superintendent on an old mare called Molly. I'm very disposed to the name Molly because I had an Aunt Molly. She was not an old mare or an old nag. She was really something. The very beginning is this horse. At the very end, in the final section, there are 7 sections in this story. In the 7th section, the automobile has replaced the horse, and the horse is hard to come by. As you mentioned, it's not a coincidence. The story begins in September of 1899.
Right.
However, we go through Christmas, and it's very clear Leslie dies in the year 1900. So she dies, she brings to an end an old century
Right.
and is starting a new one.
Yeah.
And at the very same time, all of this is going on. What has taken place that doesn't get a single mention in the story? The Great War. And to underscore the importance of this for Cather, she's born in 1873. She dies in 1947. The best years is the last work of literature she wrote. She completed it in the middle of August 1945, right after the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 3rd and August 6th after that, and just before the end of the Second World War, September 7th. You'd never know that from the writing of the short story that there was this great war.
Right.
And it has to, I think it has to be an important question why she keeps something like that hidden away.
Right. So you mentioned Cather. Is there anything else about her life that you think we should be aware of going into this story that would help us understand it?
Every novel she wrote is alluded to in this short story.
Oh, really?
Every single one, and the three stories of the obscure destinies. So this is a very lengthy, decades-long homework assignment I would assign to anyone. Yeah, everything is there in this line and that line. Um, the names have a symbolic importance. My suspicion is that the farm itself is symbolic of a small town. I think there are reasons for thinking so. Maybe we can discuss this.
Mhm.
Cather writes so with such simple, limpid prose that one might fail to see very easily that the plot construction is complex, the characters are complex, the themes are complex, but they always are. She was an extraordinarily educated woman, traveled to France. I think her two favorite authors were the French essayist Montaigne and Goethe. Um, she was very she was a very learned woman, and I think all of it shows up. So in this short story, for example, one encounters a short story by the Brothers Grimm.
Right.
Doesn't have to be there, but she's alluding to something dark. And
Yeah. But then also she spent a lot of time in Nebraska, right? I mean, that's where she grew up and spent formative years, if not most of her adult life, which, as I understand it, was back east. Is that right, just from a biographical standpoint? And you're much more familiar with her other writing. Is a lot of it set in Nebraska or someplace like McAlpin? Or
a lot of it goes well. The Death Comes for the Archbishop takes place in Santa Fe, New Mexico, so that doesn't. The Professor's House
Hmm.
doesn't. Sapphira and the Slave Girl doesn't. There are many that do not, but many do, and there are lots of short stories that have to do with Nebraska. My Antonia is set in Nebraska and also Cambridge, Massachusetts. So I think that's right. Uh, there was a woman who had a great effect on her when she was younger and committed her to a life of education, whose name was Evangeline King. And so it looks as if she takes the name Evangeline Knightley from her name was she went by Eva King, who got married, and her married name was Case. And at the University of Nebraska, Kearney, there is Case Hall named after this teacher. And Cather knew about that. Cather grew up in a place called Red Cloud. Eventually went east and lived in Pittsburgh and lived in and lived in New York. She went to the University of Nebraska as an undergraduate, and there she met Roscoe Pound, one of the great professors of law in United States history. Also, Roscoe Pound was a teacher of Peter Goodrich, who some of your listeners might know, who was the founder of Liberty Fund. Pound attended University of Nebraska, and a man named Alvin Johnson attended the University of Nebraska. And Johnson was one of the co-founders of the New School for Social Research.
Okay.
So there's this amazing network of individuals who went to this university.
So is there a biographical element in the story? I mean, there seems to be. You mentioned she knew Evangeline. You know, she had several brothers. She did grow up, at least in part, in Nebraska. You know, do you think that's significant to the story? I mean, there must be differences between the family that's depicted here and her family. Um, but I don't know, how significant do you think we should look into that or consider that in trying to understand the story?
I think it's highly significant, but one doesn't want to reduce something that's fictional to something that is that's fictional. One does right. One doesn't want to claim this is strictly biographical,
Right.
kind of crass reductionism. But she knew the world about which she was writing, and I think that shows up in a variety of ways. But maybe the most important thing that isn't a form of reductionism that's both biographical, but also much more than that, and speaks to her uh, as a great writer, is the importance of education, which shows up throughout the short story,
Mhm.
but also the kind of thinking that education nurtures and nurtures well. For example, and this is the original edition, so if anybody has an interest and just sends me an email, I could send out a PDF of this. But on in the original short story, pages 77, 78, 85, 102, 112, 137 are all about thinking. Similarly, there are discussions in the context about thinking about dreaming.
Right.
Mr. Ferguson was a dreamer.
That's right. Yeah.
Miss Knightley was not a dreamer. The most important of the sons, who's the most admired of the sons, is Hector.
Right.
He's thought to be a dreamer.
Well, yeah, it's a little unclear, right? Because I think that's mentioned at one point that he is a dreamer, but then at the end, there's this Mrs. Ferguson says that she thinks that her sons, none of them were dreamers like her father, and that they were more practical minded, like she is. So it's a little unclear, right? But that does seem to be significant.
Yeah, no, so he's held to be both a thinker in an abstract way and also very practical.
Hmm.
Uh, this Leslie begins teaching when she was 14. We learn this in the story. That was illegal.
Right.
Why did Miss Knightley, who thought this might be the case, why did she allow her to teach? She says she used her judgment.
Right.
And judgment is presented in the short story as a practical activity.
Right. So she violates a rule.
Yes.
That's a reasonable rule, but one that under the circumstances, it seemed appropriate to violate.
Correct. And
So,
thought this would be best because she has prudence. So prudence comes to light as a certain kind of thinking, as opposed to Mr. Ferguson, who's really incapable of doing all sorts of practical things. He has a farm. The farm is not remunerative. He
right.
doesn't make any money through the farm, which is why all of the children have to work to contribute to the household.
Right. The father is their cause behind which they rally because they sort of think of him as a misunderstood genius, but one who, yes, who's not very good at making money through his farm. And so they're all sort of motivated to defend him, not so much, through direct argument as through by demonstrating that they're, intelligent and can get ahead, that kind of thing. In other words, so go ahead. Yeah.
He names his farm the Wide Awake Farm. And he's laughed at, he's ridiculed for that. You had mentioned earlier in your opening remarks, Tom, about Socrates.
Hmm.
In the Apology, Plato has Socrates say that he functions as a kind of gadfly. Athens is dreaming, they're asleep. And it's his function to prod them so
Mm.
that they become awake, which means they have less interest in money and more interest in virtue, which means excellence, which could also mean excellence when it comes to thinking. Is,
Hmm.
is there a passage I might be able to read, Tom?
Please go ahead. Yeah.
So this is on page 103 of the original.
You'll have to help me so I can give people the page numbers and the volume that we sent out.
So you sent that out,
Yes.
got it. So this is in,
What section?
that's what I'm getting, Tom. My apologies. Oh, so this is in section 3.
Okay.
I think it's in the middle of section 3. It's where the discussion of old Ferg is. So that,
Right. Okay. So 565.
yeah.
In the
So
read.
there's old Ferg, and then this is a page and a half later. So the paragraph begins, his neighbors who could never get used to his afternoon siesta.
Right. That's on 566. Yeah.
Thank you, Tom. So in that paragraph, he, Mr. Ferguson, explained to her that the important crop on that farm was an idea. His farm was like an observatory where one watched the signs of the times and saw the great change that was coming for the benefit of all mankind. He even quoted Tennyson about looking into the future, quote, far as the human eye could see, close quote. It had been a long time since he had quoted any poetry to her. She sighed and dropped the matter. The she here is Mrs. Ferguson. So this is a very strange way of thinking about a farm where the most important crop was an idea. And this to me suggests something along the lines that the farm is not only a farm, but it's also a political body.
Hmm.
It's not only a political body, it's a way of life. It's not only a way of life, it's a philosophy about how to live, right? Which is really striking about the title of the final piece of literature that Cather wrote, The Best Years. The best years of what? Of life.
Hmm.
This is a philosophical notion, right? Not the best times, not the best day, week, month, not the best year, the best years.
Mhm.
And I think we need to think that through carefully. I need to
Right.
appreciate it fully. But it suggests that even though Mr. Ferguson is disparaged in some way,
Yeah.
and should be, I think, nevertheless, there's a connection to something important about which he's an exaggeration. I think what makes Hector an interesting figure is he has this two-sided character to him. He's both
Hector being
practical,
the
but
oldest son, right? Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about Mr. Ferguson and the farm in relation to Mrs. Ferguson, and then we should also get to what the family kind of represents in the community, what the public or civic significance of the family is, and then also what the uh, significances of the school that's depicted, or the fact that Leslie, the oldest daughter, is the teacher there, it's a very pared down form of schooling relative to what we're used to. So those are the three things that I hope we can get to in say the next 10, 12 minutes or so. So let's
So,
start with Mrs. Ferguson, Mr. and Mrs. Ferguson. Mrs. Ferguson
so let's start with
relation. Yeah.
Ferguson. The end of the story presents her in a very melancholic or dour condition. Her sons have moved away. Leslie, at the end, has been deceased for some 20 years or so.
Mhm.
It looks, by the way, as if Miss Knightley stayed around 5 years after Leslie's death and then left and has been gone for 15 years. They've moved out of the old house. Mr. Ferguson is filled with these newfangled ideas about what a house should look like. There should be hardwood floors. There shouldn't be a carpet. She slips on the hardwood floors and sprains her ankle. She's not very happy at all. However, in the old times, in 1899, she was, unlike her husband, who was really a lonely, solitary figure. She was a vital part of the community.
Right.
She was part of every community group. Everyone would ask her to be a part. She was very sensible. She was very prudent. So
Right.
she had this profound civic dimension that Mr. Ferguson did not, despite the fact Mr. Ferguson is apparently heavily involved in national
That's right.
politics.
He gives the July 4th speech and he's connected to the Democratic Party in some way, we know. But yeah.
That's correct. So she's dealing with civic matters on a very local level, and the town admires her for that.
Right. And then at the end, when she's in the house that essentially her husband created, and I think it's important that she owned their former house. She was able to own it because of an inheritance from her father. Um, when she's in the new house at the end of the story, she's confined to it because of the injury caused by the house itself. The twisted ankle from the slippery steps, so it's confined her to her house. We don't know that she's not still engaged with the PTO or I've never even heard of these associations that she's part of, the Royal Neighbors, the Neighborly Neighbors, the PEO, things like that. But what do you make of that?
I
Yeah.
think it's symbolic that in the modern world that has arisen, whatever she represents doesn't seem to have a place. And if what she represents does have a place, it has to be enacted differently. That is the way in which one could participate at the local level in terms of civic activities has been transformed. I think that's what Cather suggests here. And that Mrs. Ferguson is not capable of changing with the times.
Mhm.
Mr. Ferguson doesn't have to change with the times because they've always been his times. He is, to use a modern lingo, he's a change agent,
Okay.
and she is not.
And so, I mean, so is she, is that a critique of her? I mean, are we meant to feel bad for her or to look down on her as someone who really needs to get with the times, who needs to be more like her husband, in that sense? Or how are we supposed to feel about her?
I think what it points to is something. Uh, well, when Tom and I were emailing about this event, he mentioned one of the questions he might say something about had to do with Tocqueville. And I think if one goes to Democracy in America and asks, how does politics work in democracy in America? That's a question that is much too abstract. It doesn't really cut deeply enough because one of the things that Tocqueville's interested in is the difference between politics at a national level and politics at a local level, politics at the level of the New England township.
Hmm.
And Cather had read Tocqueville and had read Tocqueville carefully. And Miss Knightley was born in New England She returns to New England to live. It looks as if she's returned to New England to live. I think that's a little bit obscure in the short story. And so there's this New England township civic activity vibe about her.
Mhm.
And so I think we're shown civically two different worlds. The world of Mr. Ferguson, which is distant from the local, and the world of Mrs. Ferguson, which is distant from the national.
Mhm.
And how those two things fit together? Are they in tension with each other? How does one think through the tension if they're in tension with one another?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I read it as a critique of James Ferguson. Uh, we learn at the end of the story that he drives too fast in his car that he now has going, racing around the countryside, in stark contrast to the image of Evangeline Knightley that we see at the beginning, who's, as you mentioned, in a cart or whatever, a buggy and a horse and buggy, going at a slow pace, thinking, reflecting, these kind of things. James Ferguson races through the countryside and kills a cow. you know.
Poor cow. Had to be so Miss Knightley, and at the end, when she returns as Mrs. Thorndyke, Mrs. Ferguson keeps calling her Miss Knightley and says, I can't call you anything else. And so why can't she call her anything else? Because Miss Knightley is, in some ways, for her, an abstraction. She's a representative of a certain way of life. And I think Miss Knightley is a figure who's between and betwixt Mr. Ferguson and also Mrs. Ferguson.
Hmm.
If one just goes by word count, and sometimes I'm guided by word count, the two most important figures in the work are Leslie, whose name shows up in the both as Leslie and also in the possessive almost 70 times.
Wow.
And Knightley shows up over 80 times.
Okay. Hmm.
These are the real important figures. Leslie is no more.
Right.
Her death represents these young, you had asked the second question you had asked about what schools were like.
Yeah.
14, 15, 16-year-old who's teaching 16, 17, and 18-year-olds because this is a one-room schoolhouse. And that's the way, elementary, secondary school took place at the time.
So what kind of civic education? Well, sorry, and I don't want to interrupt you,
Go
but
ahead. Yeah, please.
what kind of civic education then is going on in that one-room schoolhouse? I mean, we do see a brief scene. A young child is learning the boundaries of the state of Illinois or something, so like a basic geography lesson. But it does seem to have more significance than that. Miss Knightley seems, strongly suggests that Leslie is a very good teacher, and we have reason to think that she is in fact quite a good teacher because the students are very well behaved. They listen to her. They're respectful when Miss Knightley arrives. Those kind of things. So, what kind of civic education is going on there?
One of the things that has to be underscored in that circumstance is the mentoring that would have to take place if the school were to function well. That is, that the older students would have to look after the younger ones. And when the great blizzard hits, which is the circumstance in which Leslie gets pneumonia and winds up dying, you see all of the students working together. And you see the neighbors coming to rescue all of the students. There's even a relay of, because the snow is so deep that you can go from one farm to the next farm to the next farm, the person who's going to be able to help these young people out. So it shows the various kinds of linkages where you
Mhm.
have a real community that has shared ends, and whatever set of beliefs that hold the citizenry together are operative in that circumstance. So I think, in effect, the different ages are symbolic or representative of different generations that exist within a community. But nevertheless, despite the fact that there are generational differences, share a great deal in common. And that's exactly what makes them part of one polity. And my guess is that's what she's getting at there.
Yeah. What should we take away from that when we think about our own education system or education today, which looks so different from what's depicted in one room schoolhouse, and yet there's a strong desire for that kind of thicker social fabric, and what civic education courses are doing, and civic educators are running into time and time again is how do we cultivate that feeling of attachment or commitment to the community, to the public good. Um, and it seems like that was accomplished without school, in that time and in that place. Um, Today, it seems a lot of people feel like we need school to do what civil society itself is not doing on its own. But how should we think about that? I mean, can school do that? Should we, if school can't, then we need some sort of broad civic revival in a way that I think no one knows quite how to accomplish. So how should we think about that?
Um, may I read one more passage and use
Yes.
that as a springboard to try to at least approach your question?
Yeah.
So this is easy to find. It's the last line of the story.
Okay.
Um, Mrs. Thorndike, Miss Knightley, comes back to New England and writes a long letter to Mrs. Ferguson. Mrs. Ferguson did not see her old friend again. It's interesting, by the way, that it's her old friend. It's unclear we would have understood them to be friends.
Hmm.
But she wrote her a long letter from Wiscasset, Maine, which Mrs. Ferguson sent to her son Hector, marked to be returned, but first pass on to your brothers. Two things about that. First, this notion of sharing and this idea of a circle of sharing. Second, perhaps I'm reading this much more cleverly than I should. I wonder about the significance of brotherhood here,
Hmm.
whether it represents a larger brotherhood than just the biological brothers. That this is a story about lessons. After all, what is this book in some way? This short story, I should say, a story about Leslie. What happens to the book? It gets passed from person to person to person so that a community is formed through the sharing of the book.
Mhm.
So I'll try to answer your question in this way. I think that teaching is one of the noblest professions on earth. And I think it's been degraded. And I think there are many who are more than willing to degrade it. And the greatest degradation would be to turn it into what it's already been turned into, and that's a political activity or a political enterprise. Right? Once education becomes a vehicle for developing, enforcing, reinforcing certain political ideas, certain substantive ideas, that's the death knell of education, because those ideas become authoritative. This is the truth.
Mhm.
This ideology is the way to live. But insofar as education is about asking questions, a willingness to ask questions,
Mhm.
uh, not make education disputatious, but make it something else, and have a shared idea of a curriculum of, and this is a long story and it would take hours, of a curriculum that goes from a young age, that goes through college, about the things that we want to nurture and develop. It doesn't necessarily mean the same books, the same stories, but it means important stories and important books, and they're
Mhm.
recognized to be important. Of late, I've started reading the great Brazilian novelist and short story writer Machado de Assis, and I'm
Hmm.
teaching him. I put him on a level of Cather. He's extraordinary. I was fortunate to find him. Uh, so I don't think there's a canon, but you still have to have an idea of things that are important and excellent, not because they are woke, not because they are conservative, not because they will lead people to have certain ideas about politics, but they will develop in young people the inclination to want to ask questions and to pursue possible alternatives in answer to them, and to
Right.
ask big questions about life in the hope that they will find the best years for themselves.
Right. And I think what you're describing is part of civic education, it's part of liberal education too. And it's perhaps it most applies, I suppose, to college, although I think it does to younger years as well. But there's also a dimension of civic education and education generally that has to do with virtue and habit cultivation, right? And virtue cultivation is more important at the K-12 level. And that seems to be what the main thing that Leslie brings to her students is that she loves them almost like her siblings who she, loves very much. And she brings that affection.
And Brian says,
Mm.
when she remarks to the group, to the family, and to Miss Knightley, I love them so, her students, her scholars, she calls them.
Mhm.
Twice she calls them her scholars. I love them so much. I think it was Brian who says, no, you only love your family.
Right. Mhm.
So she has this deep attachment and commitment to them. What came to mind as you just said the things you said, Tom, was Tocqueville's conception of what a town hall or school board meeting would be like,
Mm.
and what they're like today. The vitriol
Right.
that pervades them, that we see and read about every single day. That's that's not an exercise in civic education. That's an exercise in civic beheading.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Every time in a school board meeting or in a church or a temple or a mosque where people gather, right? The way in which people come together becomes habitual.
Hmm.
Be a practice that is transferable to other forms of association. And as you mentioned, virtues and habits and dispositions grow out of such practices.
Right. And there's a really moving depiction of how how a family that practices those kind of virtues, can improves the world around them, so it's not just a private good, but becomes a kind of public good. That's what we see in the story. So we've got just a couple minutes. So I'm wondering if you have a kind of final thought or word on this story, you can take it any way you want to go.
I think people should read it.
Okay.
I'll say one other thing. Uh, just connecting the beginning of the story to the end of the story. By the time we get to the second page, Miss Knightley, we read, has laughed 6 times. And there is this palette of colors that is applied to her. All of these pastels, which suggest something lively,
Mm.
something beautiful, something attractive. That's how the story begins. And I think as we get to the end of the story, it's worth asking why that lexical register has disappeared. What does Cather want us to think about in that regard, as the polity of that town has clearly undergone a change, and the way in which individuals within the town can help each other has been transformed?
Yeah. All right, thank you so much for that, Stuart, and thank you for this wonderful conversation. It's been great. Thanks to all of you, our audience, for joining us. As we approach America 250, you might consider, as a practice in the run-up to July 4th, returning to this volume that we've referred to, that I pointed to here, and reading a short story maybe every month from the volume. Something, if you're an educator, you might do with your students. Encourage you to think about that. If you want to learn more about the Jack Miller Center, you need to just go to our website, jackmillercenter.org. You can sign up for our newsletters. You can see what we're up to for America 250. Special thanks to our donors who make events like this one possible and all our work possible. So thank you, Stuart, one more time, and thank you all again for joining us.